one day, this guy Roberto, he's on a flight, and the plane is flying over the mountains. And suddenly, boom, the plane clips one of the mountain peaks, and the tail of the plane falls off. Then the rest of the plane, bam, crashes into a snow-covered mountain, and it slides down all the way until it finally stops. Now Roberto, he's still alive, but then he looks and he notices the nightmare around him. The other passengers are scattered all over the plane, they're bleeding and screaming in pain, and the entire back of the plane is missing. So now all the survivors are stranded in the middle of nowhere on a snow-covered mountain surrounded by glaciers. And they're in sub-zero temperatures, and it's hard to breathe because of the altitude. And to make it worse, the plane's power source was in the back. So there's now no way to power the radios to call the outside world to help. And of the 45 people on the plane, only 33 survived the crash. So Roberto and the other 32 passengers are just stuck there. So now what are they gonna do? Well, first, the group scrounges for food and any supplies they can find in the wreckage. And they huddle together to survive, hoping that rescue teams soon show up. That night, the temperature drops and it gets as low as negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit, which in Celsius is, I don't know because I'm American, but it's really fucking cold. But anyway, everyone ends up sleeping inside the only shelter they have, the plane wreckage. And that first night, 5 of them don't survive. So now they're down to 28 people. Now, aside from the cold, they have another problem. They don't really have any food. And they end up searching through all the luggage, looking for anything, and they find a little bit. Some candy bars, a can of mussels, some jars of jam, but that's about it. So this is all they have to feed 28 starving people. So they start rationing it. And luckily, one of the passengers finds a transistor radio and he manages to get it working. And through that radio, they can hear news reports about their plane going missing and how there's rescue teams out looking for them. And suddenly the passengers are overjoyed. I mean, it's only a matter of time before someone finds them. So they're out there for about a week waiting to be rescued. And then, of course, they run into another problem. That small bit of food they were rationing runs out. Oh, and that's not even the worst part. Through that transistor radio, they get a news update. That rescue team that's been looking for them for over a week, they can't find them. So it's now assumed that Roberto and all the passengers on this flight are dead. And because of that, the rescue mission has been called off. No one is coming to save them. So there they are, stuck on a mountain in sub-zero temperatures with no one coming to save them, and they have nothing to eat. Until, at some point, Roberto is basically like, well, there is one thing we could eat. He suggests that they eat the bodies of the other dead passengers. And at first, people are like, oh, gross, no way, we could never do that. But Roberto, he's like, I'm just gonna try one little bite. And he does, and it's horrible, and it's humiliating, but hey, it's food. And soon enough, the rest of the passengers get on board. And pretty quickly, eating people becomes part of the group's daily life. But whatever, finally, the group is no longer starving, and that gives them a little bit of hope. Until again. At this point, they've been stuck on this mountain for 17 days. And one night, they're all sleeping. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, a huge avalanche comes down. And it immediately kills 8 of them, and it buries the rest of them inside the plane wreckage. So now there's only around 19 or 20 passengers left. Those remaining passengers are trapped in that plane wreckage for about 3 days before they're finally able to dig themselves out. And over the next month, they're still out there stuck on this mountain. And over that time, they lose 3 more people. But after these last few passenger deaths, Roberto has finally decided he's had enough. They've been stuck out there for 2 months, and Roberto's like, man, we are gonna die if we stay out here. And it's super risky, but they decide to climb off the mountain and find help. So he and 2 other guys pack a bunch of rugby socks with human meat to take with them, and they set off on this expedition to find civilization. They have no climbing gear, no compass, and they're up to their waist in snow. Regardless, they're gonna try and make it work, and they hike for 3 days before one of the guys finally turns back, and he leaves his food rations for the other 2. So Roberto and the other survivor, they hike in the snow for another week. And then they see a river, and they follow it down for a while, and then they start to see grass, and eventually some cows. Then they spot a couple of local ranchers on horseback, and one of the ranchers had heard about the plane crash, because at this point the story had been all over the news. And that rancher doesn't have a phone. He lives in the middle of nowhere. But he gets on his horse, and he rides 10 hours to the nearest town to go get help. And soon, finally, after 72 days of being stuck on that mountain, helicopters show up to the mountain to rescue the remaining passengers. And you guys already know this story. They made like 3 movies about it and like 100 documentaries. Anyway, shout out to the Andes. So this guy, his name's George, and George has a big problem. The SWAT team has got him surrounded, and it doesn't look like he's giving up anytime soon. So this all started because George has a 27-year-old son who we'll call Trip. And George and Trip are really close. But one day, everything changes, because even though Trip is only 27 years old, he has a massive stroke. So they rush him to the hospital, and while he's there, doctors do everything they can to save him. But unfortunately, he ends up in a coma, and now he's on life support. So George is there with Trip's mom, who we'll call Mom, and Trip's brother, who we'll call Brother, and they're all in Trip's hospital waiting room waiting for an update. But see, this is not their first time in a situation like this with Trip, because he's had seizures and stuff like that in the past, and even when it feels like he's not gonna make it, Trip always pulls through. Regardless, this time the doctors come in and they got some bad news. They tell Trip's family they've done everything they can, but unfortunately, Trip is brain dead. And they basically tell the family it's probably time to take him off life support. And the family is just torn up by this news. And Mom, with tears in her eyes, she agrees. But George is like, wait a minute, no way. Why are we being rushed into this? But Brother and Mom disagree. There is nothing that can be done. And they give the hospital permission to start taking him off life support. And George, here's the thing about George. George has been drinking, like, a lot, so he's a little more emotional than usual. And doctors assure him that Trip has no brain activity. And George is like, no, we've gone through similar things like this before. He's had seizures and stuff in the past, but he's always pulled through. Just freaking listen to me. And this escalates, and it escalates, and soon George is yelling at the doctors, he's yelling at the nurses. He says that if they'll just give him a few more hours, he'll be able to process all this and decide if it's really time to pull the plug or not. But no matter what he does, no one is listening to him. The hospital is moving forward, and there's nothing George can do. Until suddenly, out of nowhere, George pulls out a pew-pew and he points it at the doctors and he tells them to back away from his son. And naturally, everyone starts freaking out. Like, whoa, calm down, buddy. And one of the nurses calls 911.
Hey, we need the police stat to the hospital. We have a family member with a gun.
So George is there, drunk, waving his pew-pew around, threatening to unalive the staff. But then, out of nowhere, boom. Brother jumps on him, and they wrestle, and he manages to take the pew-pew out of his hand. But George is far from done. He looks at the whole room, and he's like, you think that's the only weapon I got? So everyone is like, okay, I don't get paid enough for this, and they all leave the room. And George immediately shuts the curtain around Trip's bed so no one can see what's going on. Then, because the nurse called 911, the SWAT team shows up, and they put the entire hospital in total lockdown. And they don't want this to get ugly, so they're basically like, George, please surrender. And George is like, nah. And the whole time, he's by Trip's side holding his hand. And this standoff goes on for hours, with the SWAT team just outside waiting because they don't want George to go crazy with whatever second weapon he has. Here's the thing though, George doesn't have a second weapon. He never had a second weapon. He just told everyone he did so he could buy Trip some more time. So they've been in this standoff for about 3 hours, and then suddenly, Trip squeezes George's hand. And George is like, whoa! He's not sure if he imagined it, so he tells his son to squeeze it again, and Trip does. And as you can imagine, George is overjoyed, like maybe Trip isn't brain dead. In fact, George is so happy, he immediately surrenders. And police arrest him, and here's his mugshot. So then George goes to trial, and he spends 11 months in prison. But here's the best part. Trip eventually wakes up, and he makes a full recovery. Last I read, he's fine now. He even went on TV and did an interview and talked about it.
There was a law broken, but it was broken for all the right reasons. I'm here now because of it.
And all this happened in Tomball, Texas, so shout out to Texas.